Good morning. This is Omar Muhammad, and this is our 36 minutes on antisemitism. We have been discussing for the previous episodes many topics related to contemporary antisemitism. Some of them from official perspectives, other topics were covered by experts. But since we believe that universities are the centers of knowledge, from which we also believe that combating anti-Semitism can be more effective when universities are engaged in the policymaking. That's why today we have a special guest from George Washington University, Professor Michael Feuer. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation. I am honored to be part of this conversation.
Many thanks. Would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners?
With pleasure. My name is Michael Feuer. I am the Dean of the Graduate School of Education and Human Development at the George Washington University, where I have been for the past 14 years. My area of expertise in the world of education has been in the economics of education, international comparative assessment, philanthropy, and education policy in particular.
There is a lot we are going to talk about today, especially when it comes to education. But I start with this question because it's the most asked question. There are problems about this question. There are some entities who do not want to engage in the discussion, which is, what is the definition of anti-Semitism?
Well, it's an interesting and very challenging question. I think it's such a complicated topic that the idea of having a single definition that covers all of the possibilities is a challenging idea. I am therefore, as a good first approximation, I'm in line with the definition offered from the Budapest Conference that led to the International Holocaust Remembrance Act definition, which I think is as good a starting point for a discussion of anti-Semitism as one could hope for. And that is essentially that it is a perception of Jews expressed, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, primarily as hatred or distrust or intense dislike of Jews, often with rhetorical and physical manifestations involving Jewish or, for that matter, non-Jewish individuals and or their property, and antagonism or hatred of Jewish communal institutions and religious facilities. That's a fairly comprehensive and I think very useful definition, at least as a starting point to consider some of the additional nuances that a lot of people are considering these days.
Can we use this definition to understand the current wave, especially post-October 7, the current wave of protest on campus, which not all, but some of it also included anti-Semitic tropes? Can this definition be useful, and also useful to who, when we want to understand anti-Semitism on campus?
Well, it's a very good question about the use of a definition. That's a good question about definitions of many things. To what use do we want to put certain kinds of conceptualizations or formal definitions of ideas or shall we say, attitudes and behaviors that may be intuitively obvious to some people and perhaps not so obvious to others, but to what extent does a formal definition actually have a use And that's an interesting question, which has, of course, arisen most recently here in the U.S. because of the attempt to legislate in federal law the International Holocaust Remembrance definition. But we may want to talk a little bit about this question of use. For me, the answer is that the IHRA definition, as I said, is a very good starting point. And for me, the answer to your question about whether it is relevant and useful, especially after October 7th, for that, I would extend to consider what I believe to be the very wise contributions of a former Soviet dissident, a former member of the Israeli government, Natan Sharansky, who proposed already back in 2004, I believe, long before the October 7th massacre, he proposed that we think about what he called the 3Ds, the demonization, the delegitimization, and the double standards. And if you think about some of the rhetoric and the slogans and the attitudes, and for that matter, some of the physical behavior of people after October 7th in their opposition to Israel, the definition of anti-Semitism from the IHRA definition, plus Sharansky's 3Ds, I think is a very good way to situate some of what we have been seeing and hearing, especially since October 7th. So a good example would be, to the extent that on the day after the Hamas attack, before the Israel Defense Forces had even been able to get themselves prepared for whatever kind of retaliation would follow, in the very first 24 hours after the attack, there were already statements being made and protests being organized that I think fall right into the category of Sharansky's second D, which was the demonization. And essentially it was to say that Israel was to blame, was at fault for the attack that occurred and for all of the violence that might ensue. For me, that falls pretty squarely in the category of anti-Semitism as defined by IHRA, but as amplified and as, shall we say, reinforced by the notion of the demonization of Jews, and in this case of the Jewish state, as an act of quite strident hatred of Jews.
How concerning is the situation on campus? But probably for a context, what was the situation of anti-Semitism on campus before October 7? Are there any metrics? Are there any statistics that explains anti-Semitism on campus?
Yes, I'll answer that by paraphrasing from a colleague who had written this many years ago in a different context, that catastrophe rarely creates personality. It often reinforces existing traits or attributes or opinions, but it is less frequent that a particular catastrophic event is suddenly responsible for an entire psychological disposition. In that spirit, I think it's important to note that well before October 7th, and probably for several decades, there has been a growing concern for the way in which on academic institutions, a rhetoric of anti-Zionism, anti-Israel, and in that sense, so-called pro-Palestinian advocacy has been able to take advantage of long-standing historical, cultural, political, and philosophical antagonism and hatred of Jews. So there were already signs of a growing, shall we say, pattern, or at least enough signals of attitudes and even pedagogy on American campuses that, within a certain range of reasonableness, at least should have raised the question of whether it was anti-Semitic according to some formal definition. But clearly on campus, there has been for some time a sense of a certain amount of loneliness, a certain amount of anxiety, a certain amount of discomfort on the part of Jewish students, Jewish faculty, Jewish staff, and I would add many non-Jews who understood and continue to understand that anti-Semitism, although its first target is the Jews, it actually is a belief system that has consequences and implications for society generally and can affect not just the Jews, but all of us. By way of analogy, anti-Black racism, of course, the first target and the first, shall we say, most vulnerable and the victims of anti-Black racism are people with black skin. But as someone who believes in or who rejects any form of discrimination against people on account of their race or skin color or ethnicity, anti-Black racism should be a problem for all of us, as it has been for me and many of my colleagues. In that regard, I would say that anti-Semitic outbursts on American campuses have targeted and have been felt most directly by Jews, but have actually affected the community at large. The other part of the answer to that question is that there's a great amount of variance if you look across this very complex ecology of higher education, especially in the United States. There are campuses where there have been almost no known or recorded incidents of anti-Jewish behavior or teaching that would fall into a definition of real anti-Semitism. There are occasions where people are stupid and use, metaphors or images in a way that can cause discomfort and hurt, but that wouldn't necessarily be, I think, elevated to the status of, real formal anti-Semitism. In other places, it has been very, very, very strongly felt in a number of ways. And all I can say is, if there's anything that might be said to be a little bit of sunshine from the horrors of October 7th, it would be that we have now had, I guess, the equivalent of a reawakening to the underbelly of a great deal of anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish hatred that has been allowed to seep into the best institutions of higher learning, not just in the U.S., but globally.
So from what I understood, Professor, is that what we saw post-October 7, in fact, in my discussion with the senior advisor of Ambassador Lipstadt, who is the U.S. Special Envoy to combat and monitor anti-Semitism. Although the office is not related to the United States, it works overseas, but it was a useful conversation. He referred to the fact that within minutes, when October 7 attacks happened, within minutes, they started monitoring anti-Semitism on the rise across the entire world. But since we are focusing on the United States and also on campuses, if it's possible, if you can take us to that period when anti-Semitism is no longer just a discussion, and also where we are still in a discussion whether we consider this anti-Semitism or not, because you also mentioned the race and also the anti-black, etc. But when we also look at the intersectionality theory, Jews are excluded. So it's not just one line of development. Back to the question, which is, can you explain, even at GW, what was the situation of anti-Semitism after October 7?
Well, I think the observation that we saw a sudden outburst of anti-Semitic rhetoric and behavior literally in the minutes after October 7th, that validates my basic proposition that it could not have suddenly appeared without any kind of foundation, without any prior set of beliefs that were already present, even if they had been perhaps less visible or more latent. So the observation is correct. It did not take long for these kinds of statements to appear. We had at George Washington University, I would have to look back to get the exact timing, but I think it was within the first week or two after October 7th, there was already a protest right on our main sort of plaza in front of our great library, where a group had used a projector to put on the wall of the library some very provocative and hateful rhetoric, calling on, alleging that Israel was involved in genocide and that Palestine will be free from the river to the sea, and that glory to our martyrs, where they were not referring to the innocent children and women and men who were murdered in their homes on their kibbutzim, but rather were talking about the Hamas terrorists, who, by the way, by the time that protest had begun, had not actually yet been attacked back by Israel in any significant way. So we had very quickly signs of this latent anti-Judaism, anti-Israel, and I'm purposely using these phrases because I hope you will ask me about the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism, which is another part of the contemporary debate. But yes, it's unfortunate that we had very soon evidence. Now, it's a complicated story because to this day, I am not, I mean, maybe others in the university know this, but I do not know exactly who was responsible for that small protest with the graffiti, the electronic graffiti. I understand there may have been some GW students, but there were probably others who came from the outside or who helped them. That further complicates the matter when you ask about what's happening on campus. In our case, the campus is almost entirely an open campus. It's in the middle of Washington, D.C. People come and go. And so it's, it's sometimes difficult to know exactly who is involved in what kind of activity. But it did happen right there on one of our main plazas. And it took several hours for the university to mobilize to bring an end to it, which led to all kinds of further complications and arguments on campus.
In many cases where anti-Semitism was manifested, people were saying, no, we are not anti-Semitic, we are pro-Palestine. And this creates a problem when we want to identify hate speech, free speech, and anti-Semitism. Professor, where do we draw the line when it comes to anti-Israel, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, free speech, the right for the students to protest, but at the same time being aware of what they are saying? I mean, I do not want to generalize, but from watching the news, there were many who didn't know what they are talking about.
Well, first of all, that is an interesting point. I don't know the exact statistics on this, but apparently with some of the public opinion polling, when young people were asked, have you heard the slogan, Palestine will be free from the river to the sea? Have you heard that slogan? And many of them say yes. Do you agree with the slogan? Many of them say yes. Can you tell us which river and which sea? And that's where they don't have the answer. Now, I don't want to overstate that. It is often the case that people, whether they're young or not so young, sign on to certain kinds of rhetoric without necessarily knowing all of the underlying facts. But in this case, I think it's an important observation because it relates to the bigger question about whether anti-Israel and pro-Palestine, where do you draw the line, which was your question. And again, I'm always quite cautious about proposing that I know where to draw lines in these complex matters. But I would ask myself the following question. Does pro-Palestine mean the elimination, the eradication, the revocation of the Jewish right to a sovereign state in Israel? If being pro-Palestine means the destruction of the Jewish state, then I think you have a fairly clear line, and that definition of pro-Palestine is at the very least unacceptable because it denotes the elimination of a sovereign state that has been recognized by the international community and the United Nations and all the rest. If by pro-Palestine one means an advocacy for policies, programs, practices that can promote and reinforce and protect Palestinian national rights, I think I would be part of that. As long as it is clear that that does not require or imply any kind of eradication of the Jewish state. So this is where it's a fairly devious maneuver on the part of people who don't want to be labeled as anti-Semitic to make a kind of blurring of the distinction between being opposed to certain policies or government initiatives undertaken by the State of Israel versus opposition to the fundamental proposition of Zionism as a secure and safe sovereign state for the Jewish people in its historic homeland. If one accepts the idea that there can be Palestinian sovereignty, by which I mean Palestinian Arab sovereignty, because after all, up until approximately 1948, most of the Jews living in that region called themselves Palestinians. This is another historical point that some people have not noticed. In any event, I think that if one can recognize Palestinian Arab sovereignty as a legitimate goal, side by side with the continuation of a full-throated, unequivocal defense of the idea of a Jewish state in its historic homeland, that's a very different definition of pro-Palestine than what you see in slogans that call for Palestine free from the river to the sea. And once again, many of the people who are using that slogan may not be aware of the way it is formulated even in the Hamas charter, where it says, not Palestine shall be free, Palestine shall be Arab from the river to the sea. And this is why many, maybe even I would say most Jews, regardless of their knowledge of the history of the creation of the Jewish state, regardless of their friendship or hostility to the current government, regardless of how much they like or dislike, whether it's Bibi Netanyahu or those who dislike Yitzhak Rabin, regardless of all of that, when they see a slogan that essentially is interpretable as calling for the death of the Jewish state as an entity, as a reality, it falls right into the definition of not just anti-Semitism, but very hateful and I would say unacceptable rhetoric that is not applied in any other case that I know of, where people who are opposed to a particular government's policies or programs allow themselves to call for the eradication of the country. In 1968 and 69, I was a very active protester against the American war in Vietnam, and I never stood next to anyone who had a poster calling for the end of America. Very important distinction, which I think helps for people who are not so sure whether it's anti-Semitism, it's anti-Zionism. This would be part of a checklist of questions that I would recommend to people to ask themselves. Would you have the same kind of position if you are opposed to the French involvement in Algeria? Are you therefore opposed to the existence of France? If you are opposed to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, are you opposed to the existence of Russia as a state? And if the answer to that question is, well, as a matter of fact, the only country I can think of where my opposition to some of what they are doing allows me to call for or side with people who are calling for its complete elimination, that would be a flashing red light on the potential anti-Semitism meter that should be going off. If you see what I'm suggesting here.
It's very important what you say, the professor, because I also have to admit I have been discussing the contemporary anti-Semitism with many people, and we rarely get into such deep details. It's true. You have the right to call for the two-state solution where a Jewish state and a Palestinian state can exist, can coexist, whether they will have a relation or not. It doesn't matter. But when you are involved in a call for the elimination, eradication, and also genocide of the entire Jewish people, and not only that, you are labeling all Jews who are living not necessarily in Israel, across the world, as the agents of the state of Israel. It becomes very problematic. But the real question here, Professor, is that how can we integrate such narratives into the education system? Because we have heard a lot about education programs. The French commissioner told me about their education programs. The Germans told me about their education programs. The Italians say the same. The British say the same. And I have been challenging them. You have all these offices. What have you done? Where is the impact of the education programs? Are we reaching out to the right people? So as a university practitioner yourself, as a dean of a school, how can this becomes an effective method of education so we can save those youth from falling into anti-Semitism? But it can also not just education for the sake of running a university, the exact value and purpose of education itself.
Well, that's a very big question, and I can assure you that my colleagues, not just in the education school, but across the campus, and for that matter, my colleagues across many campuses with whom I have regular interactions in many universities, are all asking themselves some version of that question. Now, it is quite typical, especially in the U.S., during periods of social unrest and disruption and anxiety, that attention turns to the condition of education, either in terms of the education system has failed and that's why we have the situation, or the education system has to take responsibility for fixing all of these problems. And neither of those are entirely correct, but there is some truth to both sides of that. We have been a little bit negligent in the world of education in terms of how we actually confront narratives with factual evidence. For me, I think the moral and intellectual obligation of educators is not to allow ourselves to become complicit with all kinds of narratives without challenging them in terms of their logic, data, empirical validity, and factual relevance. And so, as a start, I would encourage educators, and I have spoken about this with some of my colleagues, many of my colleagues, to recognize their role as educators. And for example, we had on our campus during the protest, there was a gentleman carrying a sign in the protest that said, "Final solution." I don't think he was a student. I don't know who he was. And, people are certainly entitled to have their opinions. The question is, what do we as educators do when we confront that kind of quote unquote narrative? If the answer is, well, come on, it's just kids, saying things and it doesn't really, don't take it too literally, I think we have failed. And there again, I refer to Sharansky's double standard question. Would we accept that kind of an excuse for someone carrying a sign which had hateful rhetoric against Black people, against Muslims, against women, against gay or lesbian or transgender? We would react, we would confront, we would try to educate. Will that solve the problem? Probably not overnight. But as a first step, I think part of our mission as educators has to be to confront certain kinds of narratives with the requirement for evidence. If we don't do that, we are not much better than a social media platform, and we should stop making believe that the university has any kind of intellectual or moral advantage. Our advantage is to bring evidence to bear on complex questions. So I know I've spoken too long, but you get the idea.
I wish we have more time because there are still many more questions, but hopefully we can do a second part of this episode if your time allows. In the meantime, thank you very much for your insights and for your time.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. And speaking with you has helped me think again about some things that I used to think I understood perfectly, and now I have to revisit. So very useful conversation for me also. Thank you so much.
This was our 36 minutes on anti-Semitism.